And right now, we are just getting started, making sure we've got everybody in here. We've got about 40 people already and more coming in. My name is Rachel Helvering. I work here at the State Museum in Community Engagement. And before we get started with Dr. Bucy, who we're all here to see, just a few housekeeping items. If you guys need any help with technology, or if you want to ask any questions of Dr. Bucy, there's a little chat bubble at the bottom of your screen. You just kind of pull your cursor down, and you can ask us questions there. Just make sure you choose all panelists. It'll have different people you can ask questions of. If you do all panelists, we'll see your questions and we can answer them quickly. And then also at the bottom of your screen on that little kind of pop-up menu, there's a microphone. You want to make sure that is red, and that means you're muted. So you should automatically be muted, but just double check that, make sure that there's no interference as we move forward from here. Dr. Bucy has worked on our newest Ratified exhibit, which just opened, and the museum is open, so you can come visit that. She also did a lecture for us a couple months ago, and you can see that on our YouTube channel, Tennessee State Museum YouTube, and then eventually later this week we'll put up this presentation as well. I'm sure all of you know Dr. Bucy. She is a professor at Volunteer State. She's a Davidson County historian. She's had a big week. We've been talking about everything she's been doing this week because she has worked tirelessly for women's history and Tennessee women's history. Like I mentioned, she worked on our exhibit. She worked on the new Votes for Women room at the downtown Nashville Library and an exhibit at the Parthenon. So without further ado, let me pull up her presentation. We'll get started. All right, welcome, Dr. Bucy.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here with you and to have an opportunity to talk with you a little bit about what happened after suffrage. But let me first begin by saying, oh my goodness, what a day we had yesterday. I've never seen Nashville so excited in such a positive way in a long, long time. I spent the morning at Centennial Park, and I don't know whether any of you were there or not, but hearing the planes roaring as the one plane, as the skydivers prepared to jump out of the airplane. We had a team of female skydivers. Go on the Tennessean website if you didn't see them, or if you didn't see the pictures in the paper this morning. The photographs were really spectacular. And it's just been a day of events everywhere. The Hermitage Hotel has received national landmark status and unveiled their plaque yesterday. They also found out that they were rated the #1 historic hotel in the United States for 2020, a well-deserved honor for them. The room at the Nashville Public Library quietly opened. As you know, the library is still closed because of the virus. There was a flag unveiling here at the State Museum. The bells were ringing all over this city, and you could hear them anywhere you were, I hope. There were people gathered in front of churches with their church bells ringing and their handbells ringing. It was quite a day. And that's quite different from the way it was in August of 1920. Now, let me set the stage for you and just kind of give you just a little bit of background. I would assume that everyone listening today has heard some version of this story at some time by now. And just that little fact alone gives me more gratification than just about anybody, because some of you have heard me say that when I came here in 1971 to graduate school, I didn't learn anything about this story. And my master's degree was in recent American history, which at that time began at 1900. So it now begins after World War II, but in 1971, it began in 1900. But I didn't learn anything about this fight here in Nashville about woman suffrage. And what a story it is. And it has really been the beginning of the 75th anniversary, which was in 1995, as well as the events that took place during that celebration and since then that have really put this story on the map. And when we put this up online, I will put up a little bibliography for those of you who are interested in reading some of the newer materials that have come out about Tennessee's ratification, and leave it here at the State Museum. So I want you to set the stage here by talking about what happened as a prelude to August the 18th. Governor Roberts, Albert Roberts, our governor, was a Democrat. He was running for a very in a very uncertain Democratic primary, but he decided that he would call the special session as soon as his primary was over. So as soon as that was announced, Carrie Chapman Catt, the leader of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, comes to town. She can't resist coming down here to help our Tennessee suffragists, although they were quite capable, but she was a calming presence, I think, and she was so articulate and so politically astute that I think she did help the cause with just her presence. She checked into the Hermitage Hotel, and almost as soon as she did, she went out with either Ann Dallas Dudley or Abby Crawford Milton on visits away from Nashville, campaigning for ratification, visiting several cities in West Tennessee as well as East Tennessee, talking about what this amendment would do and what it would not do. Now, the very same day that she got off the train, who else should get off the train but none other than Josephine Pearson. Josephine Pearson was a lifelong educator. She had grown up in Monteagle. Her mother was very much a supporter of the lost cause, looking back to the days before the Civil War. And her mother had begged her when her mother died, before she passed away, in her last hours, to do whatever she could to stop the woman suffrage amendment from being passed in Tennessee in any form, whether it was an amendment to the state constitution or an amendment to the federal constitution. And so for whatever reasons, Josephine Pearson, who really was a career woman, she never married, she worked at a variety of different jobs, but she was opposed to woman suffrage. And I think a key to part of her opposition is wrapped up in the notion of the lost cause and what it might mean. So the Hermitage Hotel, and what a beautiful spot it is today as it was then. They've got a new rug on the floor in the lobby. It's been sort of updated. The painting on the ceilings never looked better, and they unveiled a really lovely painting of the scene that might have existed in the Hermitage Hotel in 1920. You must go do a walkthrough. It's a gorgeous, gorgeous place now. This is going to be the scene of the action. Several members of the National Woman's Party, Alice Paul's part of the suffrage movement, did come to town. Sue Shelton White was from Tennessee. She had worked with Mrs. Catt for many years before she decided to move with Alice Paul to the Woman's Party. They were here, although they were staying at the Tulane Hotel. They were in and out of the Hermitage Hotel quite often. Now, Nashville's newspapers, the Tennessean and the Banner, were political engines. They took sides on just about every issue. And it's almost like whatever one paper was for, the other one then decided it would be against. But in this fight on woman suffrage, the Tennessean, owned by Colonel Luke Lee, who had grown up here in town and was a businessman, he supported woman suffrage. The Banner was controlled by and owned by Major Edward Stallman, a German immigrant, a Civil War veteran. He had worked for the railroads, and he opposed woman suffrage. Now, to show you how this makes no sense whatsoever, Luke Lee opposed Governor Roberts in the Democratic primary in 1920, while Major Stallman supported Governor Roberts in the Democratic primary. And so here you've got Stallman against suffrage, but for Roberts, and Luke Lee for suffrage, but against Governor Roberts. So what an interesting scene just reading the papers will be for folks in those days. And keep in mind, everybody took a newspaper at this time. So people read one paper or the other, or in many cases, both papers. Now here you see Governor Albert Roberts. He is in a bind as to what to do, and he's very nervous because the Democratic Party, as it had been really in Tennessee since the Civil War, it was very divided on a whole lot of issues, and one of them happened to be woman suffrage. But he gave it some consideration. He was under pressure from Woodrow Wilson, as well as the Democratic nominee for president, James Cox, and the Republican nominee, Warren G. Harding, for president, to come on and call the special session. And so indeed, he called the special session for August the 9th, right after his Democratic primary. And luckily, he won the primary and was really ready to support suffrage wholeheartedly and see that this amendment got its fair due here in Tennessee. So this is a cartoon that's been colorized, but I think this sort of shows you what one cartoonist might have thought about the men who came to the legislature that summer to that special suffrage session on woman suffrage. You've got women on both sides trying to talk the colonel, as he must indeed be, the Tennessee legislators there with his cigar in his hand, trying to convince him what side he should vote for when it comes down to the final vote. I want to say a few words about some of these women, because these women, we really every day learn a little bit more about who these women who supported suffrage really were. And I think it's interesting to look at suffrage, and the suffrage women in particular is a very diverse group of Catholics, a very diverse group of women. The reason I said Catholic was because here is on your left is Catherine Kinney. She is an Irish Catholic who has moved to town because her husband got a franchise for the Coca-Cola bottling company here, and she is very active in the suffrage movement. We think of segregation as being totally racial, and what we forget is in 1920, segregation was also religious as well. There were invisible boundaries between Catholics and Protestants, Christians and Jews, just as they were with African Americans. The one big difference was that all white people had rights that few Black people did. The exception to that would be Nashville, where we had a substantial middle class of African Americans who were registered to vote. And on your right, you see Frankie Pierce, who was an African American member of the First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill, and she was interested in getting women the right to vote. She worked with Mattie Coleman, a African American doctor here. They had organized voter registration campaigns in 1919 when the legislature passed a bill to give partial suffrage to Tennessee women. Now, you may be asking, well, what on earth is partial suffrage? Well, they gave women the right to vote by just a bill. It was just a bill. It wasn't an amendment to the Constitution. They gave them the right to vote in local elections at home for the mayor or the county judge and for presidential electors. So what's left out? What can women not vote for? The members of the legislature. But that bill passed and Governor Roberts signed it, and Mrs. Kinney and Frankie Pierce, Miss Pierce, went to work, Mrs. Pierce actually, went to work registering voters. And they were working very hard to get women registered to vote. as soon as that bill passed the legislature in 1919. Now here you see two other suffragists. On the left with the very flamboyant hat is Abby Crawford Milton from Chattanooga. She has become the president of the Tennessee Equal Suffrage League, which becomes in May of 1920 the Tennessee League of Women Voters. On your right, you see Kate Birch Warner, who had preceded Mrs. Milton as the leader of the Tennessee Suffrage Association, and she is very active in the movement. She is from here in Nashville. Both of these women were elite white women who had a place in the social hierarchy in Chattanooga and Nashville, and they wanted to help other women by supporting the idea of women voting. Voting was the key to everything. And I have intentionally shown some of these women here because I do think we have a lot of name recognition for people like Ann Dallas Dudley, Lizzie Crozier French, the Merriweather sisters from Memphis. And I think it's important to look at this as a collaborative effort. Women work collaboratively. They are not climbing the ladder up the success to get to the pinnacle necessarily always. Now, the leader of the opposition, Josephine Pearson, she has come to town and she is going to do whatever she can to stop suffrage. The interesting thing about Miss Pearson is it doesn't seem that she really does a lot of leading of the antis after she gets checked into the Hermitage, because national anti-leaders such as Charlotte Rowe and others come from around the South. Charlotte Rowe was a lawyer from New York who was opposed to suffrage. They come to Nashville and they do more of the vocal lobbying at the General Assembly and certainly the public speaking than Miss Pearson did. But she was the leader of the anti-suffrage movement in Tennessee. And the anti-suffrage movement, how do they oppose women having the right to vote? How do women oppose women having rights? Well, they had the flames that they could light and burn about integration. They were terrified about African Americans having true equality. And so they played the race card every single chance they could. If white women are given the right to vote, that means Black women will have the right to vote. But of course, most of you understand that across the 11 states of the former Confederacy, most Black men could not vote because the states had managed to take away their voting rights. Now, how did they do that? They didn't enforce the 14th Amendment, which gave African American men the rights as citizens, and they didn't enforce the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed African American men the right to vote. How did they do that? States' rights. As long as it's going on inside the boundaries of our states, the federal government should stay out of it. And so they devised all sorts of ways to keep this social structure that existed before the Civil War still in place. They had grandfather clauses, literacy tests, property, anything you can imagine they did to try to prevent African Americans from voting, including a poll tax. And the thing that they emphasized was this would lead to miscegenation, which the white people were just incredibly fearful of. And you know, it's really a whole lot easier to sell fear of something. You can sell people on being afraid of their shadow if you work hard enough. And so this was one of the things. And they were scared the federal government might come south and start enforcing the equal rights laws and the voting rights laws. Leading the males in the opposition to suffrage in the beginning was the gentleman on your left, John J. Patrice. He was a nationally known constitutional lawyer who lived here in Nashville. He has worked as many of his clients were liquor manufacturers. He had been opposed to prohibition and had more or less been the voice of the opposition of the prohibition movement when it took off about 1900, culminating in 1909 when Tennessee went dry. John J. Patrice was the voice of the opposition. And during the fight over prohibition, he said, if you let these women, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, push statewide prohibition through the legislature, the next thing those women are going to want is the right to vote. Now, on your right, you see Seth Walker. He's about 28 years old. He is very articulate. He's been elected Speaker of the Tennessee House of Representatives, a very important position because he had the authority to a great deal of influence on what bills were voted on. And he had been at the beginning of the summer in favor of woman suffrage. Well, the first day of the special session, Seth Walker announces that he has changed his mind and he is opposed to ratification of this amendment on constitutional grounds. That was the argument that John J. Patrice made. Patrice kept a very low profile during the special session. His wife had died, and I think he was probably in Florida where he had a sister living during all of this. So you see nothing of John J. Patrice, but he had a great deal of influence with members of the General Assembly. So the antis played the race card. They emphasized the religious prohibitions against women doing anything except being subjected to male domination. And there was just plain old Tennessee politics. Who is going to make the decisions about what? Who is going to control the state of Tennessee? Now, here is Miss Pearson on your right here in the darker colored dress at her headquarters at the Hermitage Hotel. You see a Confederate veteran there holding the Stars and Bars flag. And this really tells you a lot about what the antis points are going to make, the points they're going to make in convincing the legislators to vote against woman suffrage. You see over the door there at the Hermitage Hotel, not only the words anti-ratification, but you see headquarters and exhibition. Now, this was described in the newspapers as a museum exhibition that they had put together to convince people to vote against suffrage. And they will run some ads in the paper encouraging people to come and see it. So what did they have in there? They had copies of some bills that had been introduced in Congress but had never passed that were referred to as force bills. What was going to be forced by Congress if these bills had passed? They were going to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendment in the former states of the ex-Confederacy, as well as the rest of the country too. So they had copies of these force bills. And what they said about these bills was, if women get the right to vote, Congress will pass these bills and it's going to be just like it was during Reconstruction, when those Yankees were down here running everything. And they really emphasized this was going to take us back to Reconstruction. The great irony of that here in Tennessee is Tennessee was really never under military reconstruction because Tennessee was the fourth state to ratify the 13th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. And I'm too stuck on suffrage today, aren't I? The 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves, and Tennessee had ratified that, and Tennessee ratified the 14th Amendment too, so that Tennessee was admitted back in the Union. And business for all practical purposes in Tennessee, pretty much went back to the usual order of things after we ratified the 14th Amendment and had our 2 U.S. senators in Congress, in the Senate, and our delegation of House members were seated as well. So Tennessee escaped military reconstruction, but they are going to emphasize that this is Negro rule, that African Americans will be controlling things. They really fan the race fires as to the degree that they absolutely can do that. And religion, they start, one of the ads that they run says that if you come to our exhibit, you will be able to actually read Carrie Chapman Catt's Bible. As you see this ad here about what they are up to, come and see the Woman's Bible. Now look at this ad. Can anybody terrorize Tennessee manhood? Well, apparently women voting is going to be the terror. Our manly men are no longer going to be manly if women have the right to vote. So what was this Woman's Bible? Did Carrie Chapman Catt study Greek? Well, actually, she did not. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was credited for this Bible, Mrs. Stanton's Bible, she actually did study Greek, but this is not a translation of the Bible. What she did was say that religion is interpreting parts of the Bible dealing with women only for the benefit of men. And those parts of the Bible are being incorrectly interpreted. So she starts with the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and she goes through the creation story, the 2 different versions that appear in the book of Genesis. Then she moves on to the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And of course, it's a commentary. It is not a translation. There is not a paraphrasing of the King James Version of the Bible. But that didn't matter. They called it a Bible, so therefore it was a Bible. And she felt that religion was preventing women from getting the right to vote. Now, lest you think, well, nobody's going to pay any attention to this. It's not a real Bible. It's just her opinion about how you should read certain parts of it. Oh, nay, not so. 26 or 7 ministers here in Nashville, after supposedly seeing the Woman's Bible, they sent a resolution to the members of the General Assembly opposing ratification of the suffrage amendment. This is the kind of things that they said about Frances Willard, the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union nationally, who also supported women's suffrage. Look at the racial phobia they are presenting here in these images. They had a lot of eugenics information in their exhibit. They had pictures of Susan B. Anthony, who was deceased, with Frederick Douglass, all manner of things to scare people. It was all about fear. So here is an ad that was in the Nashville Banner during this special session about this Woman's Bible. And so one reason they really wanted to play this up to the degree that they could was because Carrie Chapman Catt had been on a committee advising Mrs. Stanton about this Bible. So that was all it took. They were really pushing this Woman's Bible for all it was worth. All right, the special session comes to town August the 9th. The men come by train or by wagon, or a few had cars. They come to Nashville, and the Hermitage Hotel has never seen so much excitement ever. And with the special session convening on August the 9th, and neither house has yet to vote, a joint public hearing is held in the House chambers. Apparently the House chambers were packed, the galleries were packed, the halls were packed. It was a debate over women's suffrage And the antis put up Charlotte Rowe, who was from New York, to speak on their behalf. There were all manner of people speaking for and against woman suffrage. It was entertainment, to say the least. Here you see the state Senate chamber in 1920. On Friday, August the 13th, the Tennessee Senate ratified the 19th Amendment by a comfortable margin. That means we are one half of one state away from the final victory. Now, let's pause here and let me tell you one other thing that may be of interest to you. At about the same time Governor Roberts called the special session here in Tennessee, the North Carolina governor also called a special session in North Carolina for the purpose of ratifying. So you've got these two special sessions going on. And instead of being a race to see which one can get there first, I think there were a lot of people in the legislators of both states, in the legislatures of both states. There were lawmakers who wanted the other state to ratify it so that they would not have to go on record voting for or against woman suffrage in an election year when that might hurt them. But we are now down to one half of one state. And this is where the antis really go into overdrive, because we know that in Tennessee, the last stop is going to be now the Tennessee House of Representatives. And so there are all manner of delays over there in the House. And keep in mind, the Speaker of the House is now opposing woman suffrage. Here he is, Seth Walker, a very young man. When he serves a couple of terms in the legislature, a term or two, he will give up politics and he will become he is regarded as one of the very fine members of the National Bar Association, a long career as a respected lawyer. His primary clients were railroads. Now, here are the men that really deserve a lot of credit for the House voting on woman suffrage on August the 18th. Everybody probably knows the story of Harry Byrne, but I bet you don't know too much about Banks Turner or Joe Hanover. These men began to be called the suffragettes because they were very active and instrumental in getting that amendment ratified by the House. The House adjourned for the weekend after the Senate ratified it, and on Monday, the House Committee on Constitutions and Constitutional Amendments met, but they didn't meet till evening, and they met in a room at the Hermitage Hotel. Well, luckily, they did meet. Banks Turner was on that committee. They did meet to send the amendment to the full House for a vote. And so on the 17th, the Tuesday, the full House has a debate all afternoon about suffrage. Seth Walker speaks against it, and they adjourn without even taking a vote. Now, here is Joe Hanover. Banks Turner is from Gibson County. That is in West Tennessee. Harry Byrne is from McMinn County, Nyota in East Tennessee. Joe Hanover is from Memphis. He has a really interesting story. He is a Jew whose parents came to Memphis after a pogrom. He realizes all the patriotism and things he is being taught in school. It dawns on him that his mother can't vote. And he can't understand because they've come here to this land of the free, and he can't quite understand that. So he becomes an ardent suffrage supporter and is a floor leader in the House, trying to get and make sure the votes are there. So on the morning of the 18th, the House convenes at 10:30. After Speaker Walker calls the House into session, he immediately hands the gavel over to the Speaker Pro Tem so that the Speaker Pro Tem can preside, and Walker himself can go down on the floor of the House to speak against the amendment, which he does. And after his talking about why we shouldn't do this, constitutional issues and others, he then says, I move we put this vote where it belongs, on the table, meaning let's kill it and not vote on it. And so it is during this roll call vote that Harry Byrne votes to table it, but Banks Turner votes not to table it. And therefore, we're going to have the vote on the amendment. And this is when the suspense and the drama begin, and the surprise. When the speaker gets down to the name of Harry Byrne votes aye. That was a total surprise. As the morning began, the antis calculated they had 49 secure votes to win, and 47 would be voting against them. So they felt that they had a margin. Well, now with Harry changing his vote, that is going to change the dynamics, because if indeed Banks Turner again votes as he did not to table it, then the vote will be, it will instead of being a tie at 48-48, it will be 49-47. And eventually the Speaker of the House, in a maneuver that didn't work, but he thought it was the right thing to do, he changes his vote to yes so that it can be called up within 3 days and reconsidered. And that is what leaves the suspense of all of this. Were the suffragists surprised? Well, yes, they certainly were surprised, but they also have to be a little bit wary of what's going on. Mrs. Catt was over there at the Hermitage Hotel. She had promised she would never go to the state capitol. She had her window open, and she described how she heard the cheering and the raucous noise coming from the Capitol, and she saw some of her younger suffragists running down the hill as fast as they could, and she knew that they had won. But the antis were not finished. Now, I want to show you here, I think I can do this with the cursor. This is Banks Turner. Oops, I lost my image. Have I lost it again? There we go. Here is Banks Turner. Here is Harry Byrne. And here is Sue Shelton White. And so they were out there on the steps of the Capitol building shaking hands. What are the antis going to do? Were the suffragists ringing bells? No, they were not. They were happy, but they also knew they weren't completely out of the woods yet, that the antis were going to do whatever they could to re-vote on ratification. So the first story that comes out all over town, that they tell Harry Byrne here that if you don't change your vote and vote against suffrage, we are going to issue a statement that will be published in the Nashville Banner tomorrow, the 19th, the evening paper, that says that you took a $10,000 bribe from from Joe Hanover. Of course, Harry Byrne denies that. Everybody by that time of day knew what had happened. He had already been thinking quite a bit about women's rights. And that morning at the Capitol, he had received the famous letter from his mother saying, son, help Mrs. Catt with her rats. And he knew, he had told people that his mother's advice was part of his decision. But he had been thinking about this since the special session began. So now they're saying either do this or we're going to ruin your political career forever. We won't publish it if you'll change your vote, but if you don't, we're going to publish it and you are going to not have any more of a political life. Well, does Harry Byrne cave? Absolutely not. To the antis' total surprise. I mean, their total surprise, on the next day in the Tennessean, which comes out in the morning before the Banner in the afternoon, you see that little point, bold attempt made to intimidate Solon, that's Harry Byrne, foiled. And in between the time the Antis talked to Harry Byrne, the Tennessean got on it, and they proved without a doubt that it was a malicious charge that was totally false. They did not have the witnesses that they claimed to have. And so this really shocked the Antis, because they were convinced they were going to manipulate Harry Byrne, and they did not. So what you see going on for the rest of that week and into the next is one maneuver after the other. When the House convened on the 19th, Harry Byrne, who's really a pretty quiet guy, as I understand it, he asked, as soon as the meeting comes to order, he asked for a point of special privilege so that he can issue a written statement as to why he changed his vote and supported suffrage, even though he had been opposing it all along, red rose and all, until that very day on the 18th. And this is what he wanted written into the House Journal as to why he had done this. And he wanted to make it clear that his position still stood. He supported ratification of this amendment. And even his Senate mentor, if you will, Senator Candler, who voted against women's suffrage in the Senate, he said, Harry Byrne is a man of integrity, and I support his support of his position here. So this is what Harry Byrne tried to do to neutralize some of the things the Antis were saying. Well, that night they have a big rally at the Ryman Auditorium. The Nashville Banner runs ads, and you see it's the headlines of the Banner on the morning of, and here we're going to save the South. Oh my goodness, we are going to save the South. So we've got speakers who are going to speak against it. And here is Charlotte Rowe, who speaks about the breaking up of the family, and every argument is made to a packed house there in the House. The Antis tried to get a court injunction to prevent Governor Roberts from signing it. The injunction was lifted. They tried to get other votes. They were not successful. They tried at one point sending some legislators down to Decatur, Alabama to hide out, a filibuster, if you will. But if they were going to do that, they should have done that before the 18th, not after it had been voted on. They worked and worked, but on the injunction was lifted, and on the 24th, Governor Roberts signed the certification documents to ratify this amendment. He then sent it special delivery, which was by train, to Washington, D.C., where the Speaker of the House then indeed, he sent it to Washington, where the Secretary of State, Bainbridge Colby, of United States Secretary of State, signed it into law, signing the documents, adding the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And did the Antis stop there? No, they kept it going until about mid-September. They never, ever really, truly conceded. Finally, Josephine Pearson goes back to Mount Eagle. She will get herself another teaching job in Virginia, and she'll have a career at several schools before she retires back to Nashville, and lives at the West End Home for Ladies for the remainder of her life. But they were determined to keep this fight going. And I just love the cartoons here. Here you see the rooster having to sit on these eggs. He doesn't know what to do. Mama's going out. Here we have the Colonel, the Perfect 36, which is one of the things they said Tennessee was going to be. It really actually didn't refer to a woman's figure. It was the name of a movie, a silent movie that had come out the year before. Here we have women cleaning up politics. That didn't quite happen. The cartoons showed men left unmanly tasks, taking care of children, and women are out going to vote, with leaving the man behind. The Democrats tried to take full credit of ratification. After it was ratified, they tried to take full credit, but Harry Byrne was a Republican. And was it the end? It never really quite ended. The fight for voting rights and equality is still debated in this country. Who should vote, who should not vote. There are lots and lots of different opinions about that. And as far as women's rights go, the debate on that subject continues too. Should women have full equality in the eyes of the law? Do women need an equal rights amendment to the Constitution? That is still with us today. And yet we also have something else that happened after 1920, and we have a lot of voter apathy today. We have people who just are really not interested in participating in their most basic right, that right to vote. And so I encourage you in the weeks and months that follow us to pay attention to all the issues and get yourself registered to vote and make your voice heard. Thank you. Now I think we've got some questions. So I'm gonna get the phone here from Rachel. She's never mind. Rachel is now joining me here. I'll put my mask back on.
Perfect. That was so great. I'm getting lots of compliments already. All right. Looks like we have a couple here. We got a question about, let's see, if we know why Banks Turner waited to see, or do we know why Banks Turner waited to see how he vote on tabling the bill?
I think that's a kind of an interesting question. And one thing I didn't say about these three men, the suffragettes, there is a very fine book out by Harry Byrne's great-great-nephew, a biography of Harry Byrne that is really excellent. It tells all about him. And we have another biography out about Joe Hanover. We also, in a special edition of the Tennessee Historical Quarterly, have a paper in that issue about Banks Turner. And what I learned in reading that paper was that Banks Turner had been a political ally of Governor Roberts, and that he indeed had been in Governor Roberts' office the morning of the 18th. And so we assume that his loyalty to Governor Roberts was one of the factors that made him decide to support woman suffrage.
Our next question, do we know if Black suffragists in Tennessee, like Frankie Pierce, were able to vote? What types of obstacles did African Americans face in Tennessee?
Frankie Pierce, I'm relatively certain, was able to vote because she and Maddie Coleman, an African American doctor, ran a voter registration drive. And we talk about Jim Crow laws, and Nashville certainly had its share of Jim Crow laws. Whites and blacks are segregated in all public spaces, but Nashville did have a middle class black community of elites, bankers, publishers, lawyers. They had the very vibrant Fisk University, who had a great deal of influence. Lots of Fisk professors had national reputations. You have the Tennessee Agricultural and Mechanical College, which became TSU. You have a substantial portion of African Americans in a place like Nashville able to vote. in rural areas, particularly in some of those counties in West Tennessee, where the African American population actually was a little bit higher than the white person population, African Americans, very few, if any, had the right to vote. And that's why, fast forward to 1960, when civil rights activists went over into Fayette County and Haywood County in West Tennessee, attempting to register voters and help African Americans get registered. These were all sharecroppers, and the landowners evicted them, and so they lived in tents for about a year until they were allowed to register to vote.
This is our last one. Do you think if the women's suffrage hadn't split over questions of the 15th Amendment, that suffrage would have been achieved earlier?
I really don't think it would have been achieved any earlier. That is something I didn't really touch on. After the 15th Amendment was ratified and excluded women, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton felt like they had been deliberately hurt. They were friends with Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass had been at Seneca Falls in 1848, and they felt that he had betrayed them by not demanding that women be included. But he said, you know, the hour has not yet come. This is the African American men's hour. And so at that point, the suffrage movement splits with Stanton and Anthony on one side, and then who want a constitutional amendment to give women the right to vote. And from that point forward, they are singularly focused on that. And then the other side of people like Julia Ward Howe, for example, and the Blackwells, they said, let's do it by state. Let's go state by state and not push for a constitutional amendment. Now, those two groups came back together, but it took all of this time. Well, another thing that happens from the time of the 15th Amendment to 1920 is that women are now taking advantage from 1877 to 1920 of higher education at rates they never had done before the Civil War. So you have a larger population of educated women. You also have more single career women who are out there, who are independent spirited, who want the right to vote. And seeing those career women and seeing educated women, I think really was what were some of the stepping stones along the way to 1920.
All right, I think we're going to wrap up. We are getting so many comments thanking Dr. Bucy and just saying what a great lecture, so thank you. We will put this on YouTube, as I mentioned, and we do have one more Lunch and Learn in this speaker series that'll be next Wednesday at noon, and we will have ETSU Professor Daryl Carter joining us to talk about women's suffrage and the past 100 years to bring us up to present day. So check out our event page for that. Thank you all for joining us today. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Make sure you can see all of these.